So I believe everyone is able to hear me clear and loud. Ping me.
We can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so hello everybody. Today's session is obviously after almost a month. Now we have started doing a little less session, but more engaging. Today's topic is Learn Azure SQL Edge, Optimized Data Engine with Built-in AI by Bob Ward. And Bob is the principal architect of Microsoft. More about him a little later in the slide. We have this session with a level 1 certificate, which is like participant certificate as a customary from multi-cloud for you. And we have the supporting document or content, whatever I have collected from Bob's speeches or any free open source content around Azure SQL, which is there on the platform. The link that has already been shared through different channel, either on Meetup, LinkedIn, or from wherever you are joining in. So, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, because we can understand you are joining from all over all part of the world. For few it's like dinner with Bob Ward, for few it's like a breakfast with Bob Ward, and for few it's like a tea with the Bob Ward. So welcome everyone. Uh, about multi-cloud for you, we stand for evangelism and community. We are a bridge between corporate and startups. Just wait. We are a bridge between corporate and startup. Uh, we bring real engineers out of their bunker. That does means that we connect with most of the engineers across the world, try to engage them, encourage them to come out and talk whatever they can talk publicly on their learning or anything that the community can gain. We guide the engineering community by the help of the engineering community. We do consultancy, community, product, and research, and we mostly play in the area of multi-cloud and data. We do work in multi-cloud strategy, data science and AI, blockchain, extreme engineering, and keep on learning from the community to pass it to the community. We have the impact now. It's almost we have covered almost all part of the world. People join us from all part of the world, and this is that direct data from analytics. Obviously, we are a little heavy in China and India, and most of the Asian countries. But US we have a good reach, and North America and South America, and we are also gaining reach in Africa, Australia, and other part of the world. So fifth IR is a platform which is a SaaS platform where you can anyone can come, build in their courses, bring up their sessions, set up their events and everything, and it actually does a help you to show your YouTube channel as a course content, or you can put your private channel, private videos or anything it's needed, and you can catalog it, search it easily for different content and courses, the technology and non-tech content. Uh, you can start building your event and courses by directly linking to https www.fifthir.com/a, just/a, and you can directly reach to the admin panel, and you can create your account. You can do everything on your own, create your community, build courses, build certificate, and design everything, and run your community, run your show. Certificate recording content for this session is available on Fifth IR. You just have to search Google with Fifth IR plus Bob Ward, or you can simply go on fifthir.com, 5THIR, which is also the acronym for Fifth Industrial Revolution, and you can simply search Bob Ward, Azure SQL, Edge Computing, and you will be able to find out the course or the session that is happening on any time in the future. Bob has 27 years and almost 5 months now. That's what I gained the latest from his public profile. He has been the CTO in the past. He's a mentor, speaker, and author. He is currently the principal architect of Azure data engineering team. He looks after most of the Azure SQL work, and Bob has been working on Azure SQL or SQL Server for the past, I think, from the first version. And it's now Azure SQL, it's more SQL on the cloud, and obviously the existing version is already there. Bob has been working with Microsoft for, as I said, 27 years almost, and this is his LinkedIn profile. Anyone can connect with him, and this is MS Azure SQL for Beginners, where Bob mostly video blog on the people who need to learn Azure SQL as a beginner, as an expert, or anything. If they need to move to next level, I think this is the best blog for it. Direct coming from the product team, someone who is working with the product team directly. I am Anjani Kumar. I have decades of direct service to the IT industry. I'm ex-publicist RBS Microsoft. I am the founder and principal architect of multi-cloud for you. This is my LinkedIn profile and company I have already said. Over to Bob. Bob, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen out to make sure. Let's see, share screen to, there we go. Well, howdy, everyone. That's what we say in Texas. I'm Bob Ward. Johnny, thank you so much for that great introduction. I am here from the confines of my home in North Richland Hills, Texas. This is near the Dallas-Fort Worth area in the United States of America. Thank you to wherever you are joining us today and taking time to learn more about SQL Edge to Cloud. It's interesting, the title, and Johnny said Azure SQL Edge. That's just the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to talk about today. But let's first set the stage for what I'm going to talk about with a story. As Johnny just said, I've been at Microsoft now for almost 28 years. So back in 1993, many of you today that are tuning in weren't even born then. I was a developer on Oracle, Linux, Unix systems, doing C++ database type work. And I had an opportunity to join a little PC company at that time called Microsoft. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to join this company called Microsoft. But one of the things Microsoft told me was, we love your extensive knowledge of Unix operating systems and your knowledge of database systems like Oracle. We think you can help us mold and shape the future of a product that we have called SQL Server. And I was like, what's SQL Server? I've never heard of that. I've done Oracle and Ingress and Informix and Sybase. They're like, oh, Sybase, that's interesting you know that, because we're kind of a offshoot of Sybase and we run on, PC systems. I'm like, PC systems? What are you talking about? So it's interesting because I think about that journey in 1993 and I think about where we are today. And last year, during all this craziness during the pandemic, I was at the offices in Irving, Texas. We're doing some construction there at the building during the pandemic. So I was kind of cleaning out my office and I ran into these. These are diskettes that I was given the first day I joined Microsoft on how to install SQL Server. And it kind of hit me then. SQL Server started on little diskettes, on little PC computers. And today it's a major force in the industry. And it also made me think about, SQL is in so many different places that people don't even realize. Thus was born this idea of presenting SQL Edge to Cloud, because you're going to see today where SQL Server shows up on the IoT edge all the way to public clouds. And it is the data platform for the modern era because it exists in all those form factors. But what you're going to love is you're going to love the fact that SQL has got a common thread across all of these platforms. Now, you probably want this deck. Like, Bob, how do I get this PowerPoint deck? Look at this link right here, aka.ms, bobwardms. Take a note of that. This deck is already up there. You can go up there and find this deck and many other presentations I've done over the years. I want you to have access to all of this information. I'm definitely an open source presenter. By the way, I do want to answer your questions, so we'll go through a bunch of content and we'll reserve some time at the very end to make sure we address some of the more interesting questions you have on the chat. So let's kind of march forward here and first talk about, what do I mean by SQL Edge to Cloud? Well, it all starts with in your data centers or not in public clouds. And we'll talk a little bit about what is Azure SQL Edge and why is that important to IoT type scenarios. SQL Server 2019, our latest release of SQL Server, which launched in 2019, includes some amazing technologies for the core engine, including something called big data clusters, where we integrate things like big data technologies like Spark. What about SQL Server on Linux? You probably heard of that. Is it true SQL Server runs on Linux? It does, which opens up new possibilities for us, including being able to run SQL Server on containers and in Kubernetes environment. Now, if you want to run SQL Server in the cloud, we have these options. We call them Azure SQL, whether it's running SQL Server in an Azure virtual machine, an Azure SQL managed instance, or Azure SQL database. And we announced last year, and we continue this year, our journey into hybrid. So we've launched something called Azure Arc. Azure Arc enabled SQL Server and Azure Arc data services. So we're going to talk in today's journey about all of this stuff. Some cases we may go a little deeper than others, but that is my plan to talk about why is SQL Edge to the Cloud across all of these factors important. Now you may see this and go, this is too much. I don't even know if I can learn all of these things. Well, here's the good news. Number one, the core engine of SQL Server is exactly the same across all of these. A common thread. Everything you see here is the core engine when it comes to things like security, performance, and availability. If you're a developer or you want to use languages, hey, guess what? T-SQL works the same on all of this stuff. Or if you're a developer using one of these type environments and providers, those languages are also going to work. So application compatibility is a huge thing. Your skills that you know in T-SQL, you're going to love this. It applies across everything we have. It's very, very important. And then finally, what about tools? So tools like Management Studio, or our new Azure Data Studio, or command line tools, things in PowerShell, or even SQL Command. They are commonly going to work across all of these form factors. So I want to make sure if you leave anything today from today's presentation with all the stuff I'm going to throw at you, is that you do not necessarily have to learn everything to be good at everything. You can use and have faith that the SQL engine is common across these, languages are common, and tools are common. But let's dive in and talk about a couple of these. Let's first talk about Azure SQL Edge. Like, why did we do this? Why would we put SQL Server in a drone or actually in a small manufacturing device? Well, here's what's going on. Customers told us that they have IoT edge devices that they don't want to constantly stream raw lots of data to internet, to the cloud, or they're actually in scenarios where they're semi or disconnected and they need to do data processing at the edge. So we thought to ourselves, well, the SQL engine's pretty good at data processing, including the ability to do machine learning model processing. We know we can do things like time series and data streaming. Why don't we package that together in an engine, in a container, reduce the footprint of SQL Server, and allow people to put that on edge devices, whether that be x64 edge devices or even ARM devices. Yes, we have found a way to take SQL Server and run it on ARM devices in a native way. So it runs very, very fast. So that's what you get with Azure SQL Edge. You get the ability now to take a SQL Server container with some other software, which I'm going to show you in a second, run that on a manufacturing device, perhaps it could be in a disconnected environment, and do data processing on the raw data where it sits. But then if you want to connect it later, you can take the results of what you're processing and connect that to the cloud. Let's take a look at a demonstration of what that looks like. So this is a recorded demonstration I have, and let's go through all the components and what I'm talking about. I'm looking at a shell, a bash shell, because these are Linux containers, and in here is a SQL Server container, which is a SQL engine. But notice here there's also Kafka. We include Kafka streaming container technologies with SQL Server. This is Management Studio connected to an IoT edge device running a SQL container. Does it look familiar to you? It should. It just looks like SQL Server, hence showing you the commonality of tools and of the core engine itself. I've got an example here where I've built a table to store telemetry data from raw streaming that's going on into a manufacturing device, because I'd like to do failure prediction on these devices where they exist on the edge. But hey, look at this. I can do a column store index. Yeah, column store index technology, which is across SQL, it exists everywhere. Now we've got some special additions to T-SQL for this environment because we want you to do Kafka streaming. So we've added into our external data source technology the ability to do a Kafka data source. So you can specify, hey, here's the Kafka data source on the actual device, because what I'd like to do is I'd like to create what's called an external stream from inputs, okay, from this Kafka device. I'd like to store that. I'd like to stream that data, and I'd like to process that data. Well, what do you mean by processing that data? Well, I'd actually like to take the information, and I'd actually like to run a stored procedure against this data. How do you run a stored procedure against streaming data? Well, what we do is we include stream analytic technology in the form of streaming jobs. So I can take a job, which is a set of queries, to go process data on the fly from the raw streaming data, and I can store that in a SQL Server table. So we've added special system procedures to SQL Server Edge to do this. So I can run these queries, I can process the data raw into a format that's going to make more sense for machine learning predictions. So when I start the streaming job, we'll run with Kafka, we'll start feeding data into a table in the SQL Server engine. Then I can do something like this. I can run queries against the tables that I've been processing against. I can take machine learning models that I've pre-built and trained somewhere else. And I can run those machine learning models using native T-SQL predict functions, which is in the engine itself, to predict failures. So now instead of streaming a bunch of data from this device all the way to the cloud and doing the prediction in the cloud, I'm going to do failure prediction where these devices live. So I can do failure predictions in my machine environment if I'd like to, without even being connected to the cloud or semi-connected. And this is great because rather than these machines going out or me replacing them on fixed intervals, I can get ahead of the game and I can save myself a lot of money by predicting failures that might occur in these environments without waiting for some sort of fixed maintenance cycle. Pretty amazing technology. But there's more. We understand and we know that in these environments, you're streaming a lot of data. So it could be, you could be running into a scenario where you would like the ability to move off cold data. In other words, you want to make sure that you don't necessarily adhere to the fact that there's always data sitting around in this device that you don't need anymore. So we've added in special T-SQL functionality for you to do retention, data retention. Notice here in this particular example, I am going to take on this SQL table where I'm storing this telemetry data, and I'm going to add some syntax here to say, hey, what I'd like to do is based on that timestamp column, just keep it around for a day. So anything older than a day, I don't need anymore because I've already done all my processing on that. So SQL will automatically remove any data that's considered cold. That in a nutshell is what you get from Azure SQL Edge. You get a SQL Server engine that's in a container that includes AI, machine learning built in, streaming built in, and the beauty and the amazing core processing of the SQL engine, all in a very small footprint that runs on IoT devices. Okay, whoops, on here, and let's talk about SQL Server 2019. Look at all of this in the screen right here. You're sitting back going, that's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff on this screen for me to digest. Let's just make a review of this and we'll focus in on one interesting example. So data virtualization and big data clusters. This is the ability now in the SQL Server engine, and think about these engines I'm talking about all for edge to cloud, where I can access data from all these icons without moving data. I can now do joins across Oracle and MongoDB, and I didn't shift any data at all. I pushed the results of processing to those environments. And to go further, you can use a concept called a big data cluster to actually access big data in your own environment using the power of things like Spark and Kubernetes. And you see here in the middle, think about all those icons: Windows, Linux, containers, Kubernetes, ARM64. The SQL Server engine is compatible across all these. What does that mean? You can do a backup of a database on any one of these icons and restore it to any one of these icons, and it just works. Your application could be written to SQL Server on Windows. You now turn around and point it to a SQL Server Linux engine, and it just works. But I just showed you an example of built-in machine learning and extensibility. Machine learning services, which is part of the SQL Server engine, allows you to bring machine learning processing to where the engine exists. And we've included in SQL 19 the ability for Java to be an additional language, in addition to R and Python that we've had before. If you look at your lower left-hand corner here, it's not about being fast, it's about being intelligent. So we've included technologies like intelligent query processing built into the query processor, where you take an application, you move it to SQL 19, you go to the latest database compat level, and with no code changes, you just get faster. We had a customer, Bank Itaú, that did just that. They literally upgraded to SQL 19, were in their test environment, went to the latest compat level, and saw this massive improvement in performance and couldn't understand why. They thought something was wrong. They contacted us and said, nope, that was our intention. We wanted the query processor to have intelligence to make you faster. We continue to invest in things in security. So we invested in SQL 19 to improve always encrypted with enclaves, and things like data classification to help you with compliance scenarios, kind of like things like GDPR. And then accelerated database recovery is new innovative technology that exists across all of Azure SQL, across SQL Edge to Cloud, because it's built into the engine to make you more highly available. And we'll show you an example in a second for that. So let's talk about big data clusters for a second. I realize that this diagram is super complex. You're looking at this going like, I don't even understand all these boxes. What does this mean? Let's just point out a couple of interesting things to you. Notice here the SQL Server master instance. You can connect with T-SQL to this huge architecture running in Kubernetes, and you can run queries to access data across anything I'm showing. Now that's pretty amazing. Again, that's an example of your T-SQL skills coming to bear to be important for you. But let's say that you're a data scientist and you know Scala, or you know R, or you know Spark, I would love to run Spark jobs against things stored with SQL Server. We've installed Spark. We have Hadoop even built in. In fact, if you want to run your own big data lake, you can do that in a big data cluster, all running in your on-premises environment with the power of Kubernetes. Look at Balzano, a company that does a lot of amazing work in the area of artificial intelligence. They have taken this technology within their data center and built an entire analytics solution that's secure with Active Directory and highly available with things like availability groups and built-in availability with Kubernetes. So big data clusters, amazing technology. It comes with SQL Server. Your SQL Server license gives you the access to go install and deploy this in a very simple deployment fashion. What about this accelerated database recovery I mentioned? Why would I call that out and why it's important? It's because it's a technology that exists in our core engine, and it comes on by default in Azure SQL. So let's understand this by thinking about a story. And the story looks like this. I'll pick on some of my friends and my colleagues. I got a colleague named Buck Woody, smart guy. But Buck one day wasn't very smart. He went out there and did a transaction and deleted like 1 billion rows in a transaction in one of the database systems that we all work on. Well, that's a problem because Buck is taking down our business. He's blocking the world because of this amazing transaction that he ran, right? So Buck decides that he's going to roll this back. In fact, his colleague, Anna Hoffman, one of my colleagues, says, hey, just kill that session. Just kill your session, it'll all roll back and we'll be good. Well, guess what? It takes a long time to roll back 1 billion rows. That's a problem. So my other colleague, Pamela Hood, she knows SQL really well. She says, okay, we're all down here, but this is a big deal. So I'm going to go kill the SQL process because I know if we just crash SQL and bring it back up, all will be well. Well, guess what? When she does that, we still have to roll back 1 billion rows. That is a huge problem. So they all come to me and say, hey, not only is this an issue, but we can't truncate the transaction log during all of this madness. Bob, please help us. What do we do? And I say, accelerated database recovery is the solution. And what that means is this. In a SQL server, you turn on a database option. We will use a version store in your database to now store versions of changes so that now rollback is faster than you can even think of. And undo recovery happens so fast that you don't even see information in the error log indicating that we have to recover a database. Transaction log truncation, not even tied to active transactions. It sounds too good to be true. You have some questions, I'm sure, by looking at this going, there's no way that this is going to happen. And the good thing is we have a paper written by our development team that answers all the questions about how much space does this take, does it affect performance, how does versions work with TempDB, and does it work with always on availability groups. So this paper, when you get this deck, you can read it and get all the gory details. Why do I believe in this technology? It is what powers Azure SQL availability. We have service level agreements in Hyperscale, in Azure SQL database. In order to meet those, we turn this on by default, and we use this behind the scenes in a very powerful way. You've got millions of databases in the cloud, all running in this technology. In fact, if you look at the paper, we first did it in the cloud and then brought it to the power of SQL Server, but it's in the core engine. So it is edge to cloud. It exists everywhere you need it. So let's stop for a second and look at a demonstration, kind of what it looks like. So I'll move over here to something called a T-SQL notebook. If you've not seen a T-SQL notebook with Azure Data Studio, it could be life-changing for you. What you're seeing here in front of you is the ability to combine markdown text, which is what I see right here, with T-SQL code in terms of cells. And then when I want to run a cell, I just click this and run it. Now, if you're worried about how do I get access to this, I'll share some resources at the end of the session today. But our SQL 19 workshop, which is on GitHub, has all these examples. In this example, I create a database of 100 with a table with 100,000 rows. Now, here's the other power of notebooks. The results of your execution of the notebook are saved in the notebook. So guess what? If you want to do demonstrations for customers like I'm doing, you don't have to run anything. You can share with them the results. Or imagine you taking this and showing it as a training mechanism for your team. So here, I will start a transaction and I will delete all these rows in this table. That's only 100,000 rows, so it's not that many rows, but still a lot. So I'll come down and I'll see here that the transaction log, in this case, is 91% used. Why is that? Because I have an active transaction going on. So I will have a problem truncating the log. In fact, even though the database is in simple recovery mode, truncating the log only makes it 79%. That's a problem. So I'll roll back this transaction. Now look right here. Notice here that the transaction itself took 11 seconds to roll back. It doesn't seem that long of a period of time. What if your business was down for 11 seconds and it's a really high scalable business? Or what if that was an hour? That would be a problem. So let's go down and see what it looks like with accelerated database recovery on. I'll use Alter Database to turn it on. Now remember, in Azure, it's on by default. You need to use SQL 19 to see the effects of this because you can turn it on and off in SQL Server itself. But you can do it free in Developer Edition. I'll do the same thing. I'll delete the rows. I'll check the log usage. Look at this. Look how low log usage is now. Only like 7%. And I didn't do anything. I still had an active transaction going on. Now, you may be wondering, you're going to see how fast is that rollback statement I've got right there. See that rollback transaction statement? Look at this if I scroll down. Rollback is less than a millisecond. Is that insane? That's because we're using versioning inside your database to record the fact that a transaction was aborted. So now you're not beholden to active transactions or long-running transactions or long rollback transactions because of accelerated database recovery. So check it out. It is a technology that is available in the core engine across SQL Edge-to-Cloud. Okay, let's move on in our deck and let's talk about containers. Think about our journey. We're down at the bottom, right? We talked about Edge, we talked about SQL 19. Now we're talking about containers, okay? Why would you do this container thing? Well, guess what? If you right now are a developer, or if you're an administrator managing a server for developers, go look at containers. Imagine giving someone an image of a SQL Server version that is consistent across any platform. Portable, MacBooks, Windows laptops, Linux servers, you name it. It's consistent wherever a container runtime runs. And that's one of the beauties of containers. You now can get rid of a server where a bunch of developers come in and mess up your SQL Server. Just give them containers of a specific SQL Server and cumulative update, and they're off and running. But check at this. It's consistent in the sense of scripts and tools. You could take a SQL container image and you could customize it. And you can add in there a series of T-SQL scripts or even add a database in there or other tools. Give that to your developers and say, hey, here's an image that you can use that is specific to the version of the database scripts we're using, the version of SQL Server you're using, and all the tools you need. Just go do that on your MacBook and you'll be great. Well, why is that important? Because it opens up DevOps opportunities. In fact, when you get this deck, go click on this video. You will see from me a presentation that I did last year at the Build Conference where I showed the power of Azure DevOps, where you can make simple declarative changes in a GitHub environment, and the power of containers will automatically push through automated testing in production environments. That is the beauty of DevOps, and SQL containers give you that capability. Notice this diagram over to the right. What is another reason to use SQL containers? No patching required. What do I mean by that? Well, you could have a SQL Server container on a specific version of SQL with a specific cumulative update. And if you want to move to the latest cumulative update, you just switch. You stop one container, you start another container with the new cumulative update image, you point that to your databases, and within less than a minute, you're up and running. And guess what? You can switch back because cumulative updates are compatible between each other. So portable, very lightweight because these are just isolated processes running in a host environment. Remember, containers don't replace virtual machines, they complement virtual machines. They're consistent because it's a consistent image of SQL Server and then whatever scripts you want to add, and they're very efficient because there's no patching required for cumulative updates. You simply switch container images, point them to your database. Okay, and then one of the things that I should mention here, because I've updated the slides since I last did this presentation, is that we do now support Active Directory connectivity and authentication to a SQL Server container. Now, remember our journey. Edge, SQL 19, containers. Let's talk about the cloud. So Azure SQL, I kind of touched on it earlier. What did I mean by it? Well, it comes in three factors. SQL Server and Azure Virtual Machine is the complete SQL Server that you know, like SQL 19 that I just showed you, running in an Azure virtual environment. So what does that mean? It means that you bring the SQL Server or you use our galleries to install SQL Server. You manage the guest operating system. You manage the SQL Server. We'll manage everything else. We'll manage the host. We'll manage failover across hosts. We'll manage the networking. We'll manage the storage. We'll do all of that stuff, but you want complete control of SQL Server from the operating system perspective or the SQL Server perspective. We call that infrastructure as a service. So what about managed instance? What is this thing? Well, this is platform as a service. So forget about even worrying about the operating system or any of those type of things, or even managing versions of the operating system, the virtual machine, or the SQL Server versions. You get a complete SQL instance now running in a platform as a service. So you have access to things like SQL Server Agent, right? It is a SQL instance, just like you would see in Management Studio, but you're not going to worry about file system access or storage access. You're just going to tell us how much space do you need. You start deploying databases and you're off and running, but you're going to get the benefits of platforms as a service, especially when it comes to things like deployment and high availability. And then finally, Azure SQL Database is just a database. It is the highest level of platform as a service because we will handle the instance now of SQL Server. You literally just deploy a database or a set of databases and then worry under the covers about the SQL instance, the operating system, the virtual machine. Focus on your database. So look at this diagram for a second. Look at this picture. You're somebody sitting right now and tuning in wondering, I don't know which way to go. Well, maybe you consider this. If you want the fastest way to get to the cloud, it's probably SQL Server and Azure Virtual Machine. If you want to step up your game, though, and get platform as a service, but you need a full SQL instance, then go to managed instance. In fact, several customers are making the move to virtual machine first and then going to managed instance. But if you're a developer writing a new application, a brand new application in the cloud, and you want the full power of things like Hyperscale, then go to Azure SQL Database. So brand new cloud developers, we believe Azure SQL Database is that perfect target because we actually abstract from you so many things that you don't have to worry about from a perspective of things like high availability, deployment security, and performance. So left to right, more control, less control, but more capabilities when you get to Azure SQL Database. So let's talk about a couple aspects of Azure SQL in the cloud. Number one, when you deploy SQL Database in managed instance, you're used to in the SQL Server environment picking things like Enterprise Edition, how many cores do I need in a virtual machine, how much memory do I need, what's my IOPS. We have something called a service tier. Since you don't control the virtual machine, we have a concept called a service tier that actually exposes what capabilities you get. So it all starts with things like general purpose. General purpose exists for both database and managed instance. When you say I want general purpose, we actually will take your databases and put them in remote storage. We'll talk in a second why that's important. You're going to get reasonable I/O performance, but not the best I/O performance because it's in Azure storage behind the scenes where we're putting your databases. But it's going to open up some new possibilities for you. Things like serverless technologies now become a possibility with Azure SQL Database, which is really great for the best price performance that you need and for things like auto scaling and only paying for compute you need when you're using the database. You get one replica for general purpose. Think of it like a failover cluster instance type technology for built-in availability. Now, what about this business critical concept? You want to up your game a little bit. If you need really low latency, really fast recovery, and now a concept of a built-in readable secondary, we'll use business critical as your option. This is where you're going to pick a business critical option, and the data is going to be stored locally in the virtual machine where we host the Azure SQL Database managed instance. And so you're going to get faster performance. You're going to pay more. You're also going to get new functionality like in-memory OTP. And we're going to use always-on availability groups behind the scenes to give you access to things like one free read replica. So recovery is going to be faster here, or failover is going to be faster because we're using those replica technologies versus on the left using things like remote storage. And then finally, Hyperscale, which is specific to Azure SQL Database, is for those workloads that need really scalable performance and high storage needs. So your largest storage size exists here, up to 100 terabytes of database size. We use a combination of local and remote storage, give you great performance, and then look at this diagram. You get to 4 read replicas, which you can scale dynamically. That's where that scaling for read workloads exists and why Hyperscale can become informant. So these are the kind of choices you're going to make when you go to platforms as service because, again, we're managing behind the scenes the entire virtual machine environment. So let's talk for a second about some of the availability architectures that exist with the cloud so you can kind of see what you're getting for what you pay for. So first of all, in a business critical high availability architecture, your application ends up talking and communicating to something called a gateway. Why is a gateway important? You'll see in a second that for purposes of listener or abstraction of where you're connecting, a gateway can become critical. Now, you don't know you're connecting to a gateway. You just get an endpoint or a server name and start connecting to it and redirect you behind the scenes to this gateway. In this environment, as I mentioned earlier, your primary replica for a business critical service tier will have data locally, including your databases, your logs, and TempDB, all in a local environment. We call that a primary replica. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to deploy for you behind the scenes, not something you have to do, an always on availability group. And inside there, we're going to have secondary replicas. And we're going to handle keeping these in synchronization for you. Only one of them has to be in sync in order for you to have your transactions committed and failover to be possible if needed. So we keep these all around and we keep them available all the time. Now, what if a failover did have to happen? Well, first of all, let me mention something very important. Today in your environment, for DR purposes, you probably store your backups in a different storage location than your databases. We do the same. We're going to take your backup files for this and store that in a different location on Azure storage so that you have full DR capabilities. And guess what? By default, we'll make that geo-redundant so that if a data center has a problem, your backups are stored in a different data center in a different geography, so you could restore that if you had to. Now, if a failover occurs in this environment, failover occurs, it's pretty simple. Behind the scenes, we will help decide in synchronization with something called the service fabric with SQL Server, should we fail over? And if we do that, we'll automatically fail you over to a secondary that's in sync. But guess what about your application? Because the gateways understand how this technology works behind the scenes, you don't change your app. Your app is automatically redirected to connected to the new primary replica. And because we support a single read replica here, you do have the ability, just like you do in availability groups in SQL Server, to add a read intention to your connections, and you'll be directed to a read replica in this environment. So that's business critical. It's going to give you the highest availability you need, fast recovery, and read replica capabilities. What about this hyperscale technology? Why is that different? Why is it a combination of local and remote storage? So first of all, we're going to give you a primary compute, a primary replica, and we're going to give you secondary replicas, but we're going to add in this caching concept. Because what we want to do is, as much as possible, to give you the best performance, is put the data as close as possible to your primary replica. So we will add in a layer of something called a page server. For very large databases, we're talking about hundreds of terabytes of databases. So we'll have a middle layer that you don't realize behind the scenes. If we can't fit your data on this primary compute, either in the buffer pool or in the cache, we'll go to these page servers, which have their own cache as well. And then finally, the data is stored in Azure Storage, the actual database files. And you may be looking at this going like, well, that's not very fast. Well, guess what? The data files are rarely accessed because of the fact they're in remote storage. So we use this caching tiered layer to give you ultimate performance for your data. So you may be asking yourself, what about the transaction log here? How does that work? Well, we actually have segregated the transaction log processing to another node. These primary computes understand how to talk to a separate log service. This log service is responsible for hardening your log changes, both for short and long-term storage, and feeding the caches. Kind of like an availability group. It's not the exact same technology, but it is still log change based. So these replicas can now actually work in an environment where they can become secondaries for failover purposes and for read replicas. Now, a couple interesting points for you. You don't have to have secondary replicas. You may be asking yourself, how can I have 0 secondary replicas and still get availability? Well, the reason is because since the database files are in Azure storage, it's kind of like a general purpose environment and business critical put together. If you didn't have replicas, we could actually, no problem, we could spin up another primary replica and feed from the page servers the data files to get you up and running. But if you have secondary replicas, your failover will be much faster. Now, there's another huge advantage of storing the data files in Azure storage. We can use snapshot technology to back up your database in a very quick fashion, and then point-in-time restore becomes blazingly fast because we're just restoring a snapshot and applying the log that exists in Azure storage. So we demonstrated restoring huge terabyte databases in minutes in your environment. So point-in-time restore becomes a very, very fast environment. because of our architecture and how it works. That's Hyperscale. It's available today in Azure SQL Database. So let's jump over. Let me see how much time we have here. Let's jump over and see a quick example of availability. So I have right here an Azure virtual machine, and I'm going to kick off an Azure virtual machine connected to a general purpose Azure SQL database, which is here, and a business critical database, which is here. I'm just using a tool I call OStress. It's just running queries against these databases. Now over here, I'm going to force a failover to my general purpose database. And here, I'm going to force a failover to my business critical database. And I'm going to see what happens. So let's go fail it over here. Sorry, I need to set up connections here to Azure. Let's see here. Let me see if I can get that going. I guess it logged me out of my environment. Let's see if I can get that going. I'll get my credentials here. It's going to ask some authentication for me on my phone, so let me just get that done. Actually, it may already know that I've got my credentials here. Let's try this. Because I need to be connected into Azure, even though I'm in this virtual machine here. So let's sign in with my phone. I'm going to use my phone as a multi-factor authentication to ensure that I'm approved. Okay, let me get that going. And then we should be good to go. Perfect. So then I'm going to set my subscription to make sure we're in the right subscription. I have multiple subscriptions in Azure, so let's get the subscription set up. And then I should be able to run this. Perfect. So let's go back and try this again. So these are all connecting. General purpose here, business critical here. I'm going to fail over here. Now you notice up in the left-hand corner here, this is already starting to have a problem because it's failing over. And this will fail over as well. So general purpose is retrying, the application is retrying its connection because I'm failing over. The right-hand side is business critical, which is also failing and needs to retry as well. Now what's going to happen here, notice on the right-hand side, business critical is now up and running. See how quick that is? Because that's a replica-based system. So seconds, it's back up and running and connecting. Whereas in general purpose, it will eventually come back and connect, but it'll take a little longer because it's like a failover cluster instance. We need to go over to another replica. We need to point it to the Azure remote storage of your databases and then start up SQL Server and run recovery. But it will be faster than in many environments because we're using accelerated database recovery. So cool example of how fast your business critical can be. But general purpose is still resilient and failover tolerant because we're using Azure storage and kind of technology that acts and behaves like a failover cluster instance. Okay, so let's go back over here now and let's get back to the deck. Okay, so we talked about the cloud, right? We talked about Edge, we talked about SQL 19, Linux to containers. We talked about Azure SQL in the public cloud. What about this hybrid? What is Azure Arc enabled SQL Server in preview today? This is the ability to take your existing SQL Server environment, both on Windows and Linux, and attach Azure services. So what you can do is a couple of things. One is you can run it on an existing SQL installation. It doesn't have to be SQL 19. You don't do any migration. You're just attaching it. You're running secure lightweight agents in your environment, which is communicating to the cloud in a connected or semi-connected fashion. It allows you to do things like inventory. You can now do inventory of all your public cloud assets or assets on premises. Or it is going to offer things like SQL assessments, because we can use the power of a cloud to do best practice assessments against your SQL servers. Or you can do things like Azure Policy or Azure Defender and do security services against your SQL Server environments. In addition, Azure Arc, which we again have already announced in preview today, is something called Enabled Data Services. This is, think of like a platform as a service, an Azure SQL managed instance running in your environment, or an Azure database for Postgres running in your environment. We're going to use the power of Kubernetes to give you the feel of platform as a service running in your data center, but we're going to connect it to Azure. So you're going to do things like versionless SQL servers now, just like we do in the cloud. Don't worry about versioning anymore. We'll take care of that. We can do elastic scale for you, scale up and scale down very easily, just like you can do in the cloud. And then just like an Azure Arc enabled SQL Server, give you that unified look and experience. Let me show you real quick one interesting advantage of having this technology. So I've got over here in the portal a look at something called Azure Defender. Let me move it over here and show it to you. Azure Defender comes from the Security Center in the portal. You can see in this environment, this is a complete look of security across all my assets in the cloud. And it could be that these assets are in your data center with Azure Arc. So in this example here, I've got Azure Defender coverage on SQL Server and virtual machines, Azure databases. Again, it could be Kubernetes, or I can look down here and I can do vulnerability assessments, things like checking for best practices for security against virtual machines, against SQL databases, or even against containers. And Azure Arc could also be part of that. So having Azure as a service running as agents in your environment or in the public cloud now gives you this holistic view of things like security. You can now look for things like SQL injection attacks across your entire environment. That is one of the powers of the cloud that we're giving you with things like Azure Arc enabled data services and Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. Okay. So you've seen quite a bit. You've seen about how the Edge brings the power of SQL to the IoT to do processing with things like streaming and machine learning and analytics at the point of origin at the edge. You've seen that SQL 19 is the latest major version of SQL. It's a modern platform giving you things like big data technologies, data virtualization, intelligent query processing, and accelerated database recovery. But Linux may be your thing. And so you may be looking at things like open source platforms, running Linux, or even things like containers, and seeing the power of what consistent images could bring, even for things like Azure DevOps scenarios. We showed you the public cloud, Azure SQL Suite, Azure all the way from infrastructure as a service to platform as a service, and our intention for Azure Arc to bring the power of Azure and Arc together, the public cloud and your on-premises. This lineup is quite frankly mind-blowing. From the days of doing diskettes on little servers, SQL Server now Edge to the cloud is a powerful force in the industry. But remember, the commonalities here. T-SQL, the core engine, security, performance, and availability, tools, and languages work all across this the same. So a couple of resources before we flip over here and answer some of your questions is this. If you want to get started with the Edge, here's a resource for you to look at. And this deck, again, is on aka.ms, Bob Ward MS. aka.ms, Bob Ward MS, the complete deck. You may want to look at something here that's very interesting here, and that is a couple of resources that I'll show you here. One is SQL Workshops, free training for you and a GitHub repository for everything I've talked about today, for free. Second of all, this is Azure SQL Fundamentals. If you today want to get certified with the DP300 exam, people have told us they have gone and done that learning path, which comes with a free sandbox for Azure SQL. And they've been able to pass the exam by simply going through that training. Now, what would be a session without doing shameless plug for books? As you see over here, these are 3 books I've written over the last 3 years. It starts with SQL Server on Linux, SQL 19 Revealed, and Azure SQL Revealed. I've had people also tell me that they've taken Azure SQL Revealed, they've read the book, they've done all the exercises, and they've been able to be certified with Azure SQL simply by doing that. It was a great joy to write that book. All of these books, what I love is the first chapter is all about the history of these projects. And then Practical Azure SQL Database for Modern Developers. Some of my colleagues have written a great book for developers. So if you're one of those developers wanting to write a new app in the cloud and go to Azure SQL Database, this is your guide to how to do that. A lot of stuff I covered. I totally get that. A lot of information that you are trying to absorb. The biggest thing today I want you to walk away with is that SQL is everywhere you need it. In every platform you can imagine, with common engine, common language, common tools. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen. And on Johnny, I'm going to come back to you. I hope you've enjoyed that session on Johnny. I hope that your audience enjoyed that. And maybe we have some time to go over a few interesting questions.
Yes, this is fantastic. And the new feature that has been enabled is really amazing. The way SQL has improved and progressed with the time. I still remember when I was at Microsoft, we were working on SQL Server 2005 and 2008 was to come, and I was in a team where we were mostly working on SSIS and SQL Server, building a testing data warehouse, big data warehouse platform to deal with it.
Sure.
Yeah. So obviously, it's amazing to see a lot of improvement that has happened either at the container side, or you see giving the same experience at the edge or on the in-premises server or directly on the cloud is fantastic. And the way you saw about container is another good thing. Obviously, we had to struggle a little more around container before, but I believe that with this new releases, I think it will be very easy for us to host SQL Server on container. And similarly on the AS devices and the ARM devices that you talked about. So
Absolutely.
obviously, to come up with a lot of questions there, we can see multiple questions that people have asked to us, and I will just
Are there any
go
that
through.
stand out for you that I should address?
Yes. So yeah. So let me start with the first question. Just give me a moment. All the features are available in SQL Server 2019 edition is available only in Azure from BPIN to everyone. Yes, all available in SQL Server 2019, right?
Yeah, so when I showed the SQL Server 2019 slide with all those different quadrants, big data, technology, et cetera, those all exist in SQL 19.
Oh.
We try to do the best we can to make sure that just about any feature you want exists everywhere SQL Edge to cloud. Sometimes there's some limitations. There are a few things that, like for example, Polybase, which is data virtualization, is not fully available yet in Azure SQL services. It would be an Azure SQL virtual machine, but we're looking at that. Like, how do we make sure that's available? But we'll pick on machine learning services, which is in SQL 19. That is now in preview in Azure SQL Managed Instance. So it's pretty hard to find a feature that doesn't exist somewhere that exists somewhere else. Again, that's that common thread we try to do across all those technologies.
That's fantastic. Another question is, what happened when you already committed a transaction and you want to roll back that? Does it help using a store approach? I think he's asking more around the transaction approach that you saw. Now it's very fast.
The accelerated database recovery?
Accelerated database recovery, yeah.
Yeah. The great thing about accelerated database recovery is this. If you're just committing transactions, then you probably won't see much effect out of this, except for the transaction log is not tied now to active transactions. So while you have long-running active transactions, even if you commit them, transaction log truncation won't affect you anymore. If you're running a lot of transactions and you're not explicitly rolling them back, you're just running them for long periods of time and your server crashes. We have to do undo recovery for those active transactions. Now accelerated database recovery makes that a very, very fast environment. So it's not just about explicit rollback. It's really more about undo recovery and not being tied to active transactions.
Cool. I think Azure, it's answer your question. Azure, by
I'm sorry?
I was just trying to ask with Azure that does it answer his question? Yeah, he's saying.
I'm sorry, I'm seeing the chat now. I was like, where is the chat for this? Okay, I'm seeing the questions now.
Yeah.
Okay. You want me to go through some of these?
Yes, another one.
Yeah. Does Azure SQL have ML services? And I think I addressed that it's in VM already because SQL Server fully is in there. And it's also in a managed instance today.
Yeah. Another question is, does SQL Edge have something similar to SSIS integration services, which can connect across and process the SQL big data AI ML job etc. This is from Atul.
I'm sorry, where is that question?
I think he has pinged me privately. Some question people have pinged.
Oh, okay. So I'm not sure I understand the question. So I'm not trying to understand it.
I think he's asking, does SQL Edge have something similar to SSIS integration services, which can connect across and process the SQL big data AML jobs?
For Azure SQL, you mean, right?
Azure SQL Edge. SQL Edge.
Yeah. Oh, for Edge. Sorry, for Edge. Yeah. No, today we don't offer like an SSIS container necessarily to run that, but we do support the ability to export and move data to the cloud. So that exists today through what's built in the Edge. It doesn't exist in the form of SSIS jobs necessarily, but we do have a way of actually doing that.
Okay. Another question is on VM, you will get SQL Server. So I think this is the answer to someone. Someone is asking about blockchain. So whether blockchain was mentioned, so SQL is enabled with blockchain or something. Oh, okay. So he's talking about our platform. Yeah, I will answer that out.
Okay. Yeah.
Accelerated database recovery is enabled by default in SQL Server 2019, right?
And the answer is no, it's not. That's an option you would turn on. You would opt into that. It's not on by default in 19. You would turn that on for your database.
Yeah. Someone is talking about a use case. He says Lohit is talking about we have CPU issues with respect to SQL Server 2019 after we migrated from SQL Server 2012 and changed the compatibility. Can you guide us where are we start to fix the issue or something like
Absolutely. That? Query Store. Use Query Store. Query Store is a technology in the SQL Server engine that you can enable for your database. It can help guide you on changes in performance, especially across database compat changes. So absolutely take a look at Query Store and see how that can help you focus in on what queries may be having those CPU issues.
Yeah, so Mark T was trying to answer that out with that's a big jump. Maybe incremental jump in compate level, cardinality estimator change in 214. I think he's just discussing on
and by the way, that's actually what we really recommend to customers to do. Move to SQL 19 so you can take advantage of things like accelerated database recovery. You know, that just is independent of a database compat level, but stay at your old compat level. And then use Query Store to start measuring, if I change compat level, what would the performance actually look like?
And Naga is asking, can we expect polybase in Azure SQL MIs? MI is, I think.
We don't have that. We don't have the full polybase capabilities that we have in SQL 19 and managed instance today. We are evaluating how can we provide data virtualization, that concept, in a managed instance environment. It is an Azure virtual machine today, but not a managed instance, and that's something we're taking a look at.
Okay, and another question we're going to take is, are there any changes planned for service broker technology? I am reading a 2008 book on service broker and looks like nothing new with service broker has changed since then. So service broker,
we fully support service broker as we have in the past. Fully supported feature of SQL Server. In fact, it actually is one of the reasons why SQL Managed Instance exists, because you can do service broker with Managed Instance now. But no, as of right now, there's no announced new functionality or enhancements to broker that I can talk about today that we have.
Yeah. So any other question, or else I will announce the code for the certificate.
Can I real quick here? This one here, does ADR work in the same way in secondary DBs in AOG post failover? And the answer is yes. So first of all, accelerated database recovery is really interesting in an always on availability group environment because your read replicas can use versions that ADR is producing. And if you fail over, ADR is enabled for those databases, and that becomes the new primary, and so ADR kicks in. So yeah, that all works really well with availability groups.
Hey, Anthony.
Yeah.
This is Dhiraj Singh. Hi, Bob. I have a quick question. I'm from Northern Virginia. My name is Dhiraj Singh.
Hey, Dhiraj.
Good. How you doing?
Yeah.
Had a quick question. Can you please tell me a little about multiple user accessing together, like in terms of performance when we have like close to 4,000 users or something? Can you throw some light on the performance towards database side when we use Edge?
For accelerated database recovery?
Yeah.
Oh, for that feature?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Dhiraj, I really recommend what you do to get your full answer. It's fully supported. And that's why it's by default on an Azure. In the deck, and maybe I can put this, let me see. Can I put in a chat for everybody? Let's see here. For everybody? How do I do that?
I think you can, yes.
Okay. I was just saying, aka.ms, bobwardms, that is where the deck is. Sorry, that went to a private chat person. Anyways, yeah, I don't know how to do it.
Can you just select every one?
There we go. aka.ms, bobwardms. That's where the deck is. So in that deck, on that slide, there's a white paper that our engineers wrote. And in there is a very detailed testing experimentation cycle where they talk about what you're asking about. What if I have a bunch of users? What if people are asking us at the same time? And they show you the result of using benchmarking to see, would this affect you or not affect you? So I highly recommend you go in and get all the details that they talk about in that paper, some great information that they did and all the testings that they did using accelerated database recovery.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so shall we announce the code now?
Sure.
Yes.
I just want to tell you, Johnny, I just want to tell you one thing real quick. thank you, thank you, thank you, the bottom of my heart for you hosting this, for you hosting community sessions. To everybody out there tuning in today, you may have seen our announcements about how we're trying to help the community out there for Azure Data. You know, we believe that the community owns it, but we help empower it. So I'm a big believer in our community, the SQL family, and I want to continue to support events like this so that you can further your knowledge. I don't do this, you know, for my personal benefit. I do it for your benefit. I want you to have all the knowledge I have about SQL Edge to Cloud. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, for helping us. Let us know so much, mentor us today, and this was really fantastic. And here is the certificate code for the people who want to take the certificate. I've already ping you the link. This is like fifthIR.com Dana event TID 0002. It's already I pinged on all the platform. You can simply click that link and it will take you to there. I will also quickly show you what we have set for this event, where you will get the recording, where you will get everything that Bob has talked about, all the links that he has talked about. We'll put in there so that you can directly and easily go from there. If anyone who was not able to join, he can definitely get benefited from it. So this is the code BWASE. So it's Bob Ward Azure SQL Edge, all in capital. You just have to pass in here, put your name, email, and detail, and then pass in the code here. Now the next thing is I will simply take you through the link where the whole thing has been set up, where you will get the certificate. Once you get it, obviously you will get the email and also the what do you say for this. Maybe the email may be a little delayed because we queue it for the community session. You simply have to search Bob Ward or Azure SQL on the home page. It's fifthIR.com. You'll get to the session here. Once you are here, if you have already logged in the system in the past, anytime it will just allow you to play it like YouTube. Here the same streaming has been happening. Many people had been watching here, so it's the same recording will be there. So there's no state change. It looks like the same whenever you come. Even after a year, it looks like the same. You experience the same session like Bob talking as he is talking today. And another thing is, once you are there, you will see the certificate link here at the bottom. So below this, there is a certificate link. There is some issue with my system. So you'll see there is a hat icon which actually shows up the certificate link here. So it says certificate ready to download, where you can download the certificate. There's a quiz which is mostly takes you to the FAQs related to Azure SQL Edge we have found and collected, where files has been like directly SQL Edge file which is there on the Microsoft site, and we'll simply add it with the what Bob has given. We'll be able to download it. This is more video directly on the channel 9 which we have connected. You can directly click in, go to channel 9. We'll add up more content here, but I will take it from the Bob, and you can simply get it anytime from this link. You would have got the email when you register for it. So anytime this link is handy, even if it's not there, it's very easy. You just have to go and simply search for Edge by Bob Ward or whatever, and it will be able to find it out, of course, for you. So this is all, and thank you, Bob, for mentoring us today. And this was fantastic with a great mentor like you and expert like you.
It's my pleasure, my honor. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me.
And we'll try to get more and more learning from you in the future whenever we get some of the time from you.
Sounds great. I hope everyone has a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
So much fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Anthony.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Sure, dude.